The September 15th, 2021 meeting of the Danville Architectural Heritage Board. First order of business, as Dana rummages through to find them, is approval of our minutes from 8:05.
So moved. I'll second it.
I have a motion to approve. I have a second. Any discussion? All in favor? Aye. That passed. Now, Joni, you want to tell us about our two?
Yes, I do. You will be very happy to know that the new guidelines for the installation of public art are now in place. Yay, and after working with Nikki Kincaid over at the Art Center, I'm sorry? Yeah, can you not hear me? Is this better?
Better.
Better, okay. Nikki and I went back and forth with several emails, as you can see in your packet. The application of that public art is in the appropriate place. It's applied appropriately. It is of the right size and type, and there's no issues there, so I recommend that it is approved.
That's the one on the Nancy Davis building,
Yes,
right? Okay.
I mean, and honestly, of all the applications that we've had in public art, that's a really good place because that particular side of the building's a little blighted and not that attractive, and that will extend what they've done in the parking lot up onto the building. I think they're trying to make that kind of a event area for them. So I think it'll improve the look. It's already painted masonry. It meets all of our guidelines.
So as you've stated, the finding of fact is that is appropriate and can be approved.
That is correct, sir. I think it's the floral motif that will just continue into that area, some vining and stuff like that.
I'd heard John ask for begonias.
Begonias.
Yes.
Approve the begonias. It meets all of our requirements, folks, so, and the design is, it is their own, so. we're in
Poor
pretty
Miller's
good
gonna
shape.
think he's landed in crazy town with us.
No, Orloff is well aware of public art and on
Okay,
historic
okay.
buildings and all of the unsettlement about that. So luckily for us, we are now, I think, in good shape to move forward with any public art projects that come without any kind of issues.
Now my agenda says 409, 415 West Main. The application says 401. Okay, I'm sorry, yes. Approval for the 409, 415. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Have a second? Any further discussion on this? Finding of facts in place, correct?
Correct?
All right, all in favor? Aye. Doesn't appear to be any opposition.
Glory be.
Good luck to them.
I'm very pleased.
And I'm glad, as a personal opinion, I'm glad, it's a blighted area, and that's going to perk it up rather nicely.
It is, and I think that that's a really good application and use for public art. So I think that they followed the textbook example of what that needs to be in the historic district. So I'm very pleased that we are through that process.
Okay.
There is one condition, as you will see on your approval, the liability, the release of liability, we're still waiting on, but Nikki's aware of that. I don't think that they're actually going to start that mural for about 2 months. So we've got some time with the city attorney to get that done, and she's aware that that's a condition to move forward, is to get that release of liability for the city signed.
Very good.
And other than that, we're good to go.
All right, ma'am. You want to tell us about 321 West Walnut?
Right, this is Barbara Hilp's property, back that we looked at a few months ago when we approved the cedar shutters.
Yes,
They
yes,
wanted to
yes.
paint the building, and Barbara decided not to do that after I went and talked with her, because that is against our guidelines. The building, I don't know that it's a contributing building. I have not done the title search. I suspect that it's not quite 50 years old. I think it was probably built in the 80s. So
Yeah.
it's not a contributing building to the district. What she's done with the building looks very nice. The doors on there currently are very old commercial doors, so she wants to put in a metal glass door. I think that would really open up the front of that building. It suits our design guidelines as far as use for alternate materials within the district. So I would also recommend that that would be approved.
And that's all residential right now, isn't it?
There's two, she's running an Airbnb
Oh,
out
okay.
of the top of it, which are very nice. She's done a wonderful job with using a lot of rehab into those one building that actually fronts 4th Street, and then this building is a continuation of it. As you come across the top of the 4th Street structure, you can go through that back door. So the 2 top buildings are Airbnb, and then I think she's going to lease the bottom 2 structures out as a commercial structure. So these doors work very nicely for commercial entrance on that.
And that fits our finding of fact. Everything is-
Absolutely. She is well within, there should be no conditions on an
Okay.
approval for that. She's good to go.
Any questions? I'll entertain a motion. Pat made the motion. Second from Mayor Bowling. Any further discussion? With finding of fact being appropriate, all in favor? Aye. Any opposed? None opposed. Thank you again.
All right.
Let's see. Your staff approval from 131 North 4th.
This was a simple wall sign. The young lady contacted me. She is opening a business in where the old haberdashery used to be, which is right next to Gypsy Run.
Yes.
She applied for a wall sign. It fits all of our criteria as far as how it is applied to the building and what type of sign it is. So it was staff approved. I'm not sure, I don't think she has it installed yet. I was just over there the other day and I did not see it installed. But it could have been this week. I haven't seen, it's not, okay. Okay. I was over there maybe the end of last week and I didn't see it. So I guess she is in the process then of moving in to that. I do not know what kind of business it is. It was, what did it say? Hearth and easel, so I'm kind of guessing maybe it's an art store, but I'm not really sure. Unsure of that. If you have any questions, I'll happily answer them about that.
Okay. So moved.
Good deal.
Actually, no, it's just informative. so-
Yes,
Yeah.
we don't have to have your approval for staff approval unless you find it is not appropriate, and then we can.
It's not a new record, but 8 minutes into the proceedings, and I think we're
Good.
ready for our guest.
We are. So I am so very pleased that Mr. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice today. Mr. Orloff came down, and he is happy to present to you about our certified local government. This will fulfill your all's requirements for training for the year. So I'm very pleased that you made it. And this is very informative. I listened to it yesterday, and it helped me out some to know a few more things I need to be doing. So I think you all will find it pretty good. I will turn it over. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. I have a soft voice. If you can't hear, let me know. Thank you, Joni, for inviting me down here. I appreciate it. My name is Orloff Miller. I work for the Kentucky Heritage Council. I run the Certified Local Government Program for the council, and I'm their preservation planner. So over the next 5 years, the plan covering that 5 years is going to be written in the coming year. I was actually trained in American civilization. That was my doctorate. And the emphasis was on historical archaeology, on vernacular architecture, and on preservation planning. And I realized yesterday when I said, I've been at this since 1991, that this is my 30th year in the field. That's really shocking. I got a lot older yesterday, yes. What I'd like to do is start by addressing the 300-pound gorilla in the room over here at the corner. I'm willing to bet that everybody here in this room has at one time or another felt a little embattled by an angry landowner coming before this board or in any kind of enforcement for historic preservation. It can take the form of an angry landowner who didn't realize that she was in the historic overlay district. It can be a developer who purchased a property before learning that his plans did not meet design review. It can be the guy who thinks that listing his business on the National Register means that he's subject to design review. He's not. A National Register district is different from an historic overlay district. Or the renovation contractor who can't get his tax credits because he began stripping down to the stud walls before he contacted the Heritage Council. These are all good examples of what ideally should be a preventable anger. And the telling point there is how much public outreach we can efficiently accomplish. Technically, with enough public outreach, but in the real world, people slip through the cracks, and actually more to the point, most property owners resent any attempt to restrict what they think of as their own fee simple property. And it's a cultural value. It's not just a private opinion. It's a cultural value. It's my property. I can do what I want with it. And over the last generation, I can remember the first Earth Day, we've done a really good job of teaching a community responsibility for pollution on public property, for environmental awareness on public property. We've done a much poorer job at describing cultural resources and why they are also a group responsibility. And that's really what federal law is based on, that there is a corporate responsibility for individual cultural resources. And so what we have to do is change the dialogue so it shifts from one of outsiders imposing restrictions on what I do and shifting it to my internalizing respect for what's on my land and how to keep it whole for the next generation. And that's going to require more education over and over, public outreach. Today, I want to review, let's see if this thing works. Yes, I'm going to ask you to crane your necks. I'm sorry, there's a PowerPoint going on behind you. Keep in mind with every angry group that you are a public servant, that you're here to serve the greater interest, but you're also here to talk with that angry landowner. How you do it is critical, because if you do it wrong, you can end up in court. If you do it right, then the landowner is better informed when they left the room than they were when they came in, and hopefully with a greater respect for their responsibilities to the next generation. I'm going to cover some key concepts this morning. What I want to talk about, and what I've done is put the enabling legislation on the slide here. But what I want to talk about are the commitments of being a certified local government, the responsibilities of local CLG staff, and by that I mean Joni. So Joni is getting training this morning, and you're here to hear it so that you understand what her responsibilities are. I'm going to talk about key concepts of historic preservation that you need in order to make your decisions, talk about design review, public outreach, and then note the legal precedents on the screen here. I also want to make sure everybody understands that I'm teaching to the lowest common denominator. I'm teaching to the person that has no experience. And I suspect all of you have a lot more experience than that, so some of it is going to sound very familiar. That's good. It's just a reminder. And I'm also going to get kind of pointed about when dysfunction occurs. And I need to warn you, I know nothing about you people, and it's not actually aimed at any one person in the room. I am actually too ignorant to do that. It's just common problems I've seen in the activities of these boards. Now, you hear this phrase a lot. It's usually empty words. Hi, I'm from the government, and I'm here to help. Ronald Reagan said those were the scariest words in the English language. Hi, I'm from the government, and I'm here to help. But what we've really got going on here is a nice three-tiered system of government entities that are there to create an historic preservation environment nationwide. And it starts with the National Park Service. They administer the funds. It's the Historic Preservation Fund, or HPF. That fund is not funded by taxpayer money. It's funded by licensing for offshore drilling rigs. Those funds are administered by the Kentucky Heritage Council, your state SHPO, your state Historic Preservation Office. And the funds are granted for historic preservation activities to city and county governments who qualify for the CLG program. The whole CLG program, whoops, what just happened there? Okay, there we go. Is based on fostering a sense of shared responsibility for the built environment. And that's actually a good word because people think cultural resources are kind of amorphous. but built environment, people kind of get that immediately. These are the responsibilities, the threshold things that you need to have in order to be a CLG program. A preservation ordinance, creating an historic overlay district, check. A qualified staff person, check. An architectural review board, and a preferred name is Preservation Commission. I see that you folks have changed it to a less confrontational name already. That board commits to annual training and setting annual goals. I'm going to recommend later that you create an annual retreat for this board in which you have a chance to brainstorm what your priorities are in the coming year. You have to have design review guidelines in place. You have to have a preservation plan. And the preservation plan is actually different from your city-county comprehensive plan. The preservation plan is its own thing and is a federal requirement of the program. You need to have an ongoing commitment to the identification of cultural resources, their evaluation for nomination to the National Register, designating them to the National Register, and protecting them. You're also intended to review and approve or disapprove any National Register of Historic Places nomination that occurs within your purview. And often the best way to do that, since there's also a requirement that anybody in a National Register district needs to be notified, all the landowners, it's probably a good idea to have that public meeting here in a CLG meeting. So there's a structure to what's going on. From our point of view, the most important responsibility is you have to ask us for money, because we're given the money every year and we have to spend every dime. And if you don't come up with a really good project, somebody in another city is going to come up with a project of lesser quality, and we'll be forced to give the money to him or her. I'd rather not do that. If you have a good idea, we want to fund it. So make a point of making those grant proposals annually, because the money is there. For Joni, the responsibilities of staff. You need to oversee and promote the required functions of the certified local government. There's a lot of cultural reticence about historic preservation. Some threats actually come from within the government itself. I've dealt with some organization where the mayor was not on board. Here the mayor is literally on board, which is wonderful. But there's a lot of places where some of the greatest friction is generated from within the government itself. They don't understand what we're trying to accomplish, or they disagree with what we're trying to accomplish openly and try and undermine it. So part of Joni's job is to carry the flag into other city meetings and tell them what the wins are. Tell them this place got renovated, or this place got a walking tour, or we were able to put up a website, or whatever it happens to be, and take that win to everybody. Another way of integrating better into city government is to make sure that codes enforcement is enforcing your decisions as well, so that they know and understand what your decision is about what the landowner is going to do to a property, and they do a follow-up inspection to make sure that's actually what happened. Codes enforcement is a natural partner in what you folks do. You also need to ensure, and this is for Joni, that every resident in the overlay district is aware of the design review guidelines. Throw a party, offer cookies, offer donuts, offer coffee, and hand out hard copies of the design review guidelines to every landowner. It should not come as a surprise at the time when somebody has the ambition to do something with their house, that this seeming hurdle is in place. The design review guidelines actually protect their property values and should be seen as an asset, not an obstruction to what's going on. I made it all the way through a doctoral program in archaeology without ever being trained in project management. And when you think about it, every archaeology dig is a project requiring management. There's a timetable, there are personnel, there's equipment, there are logistics costs. I never had any training in that and was kind of thrown in the deep end as soon as I got that degree. And I spent the last 30 years making mistakes in project management. So Joni, if you run into a project management problem, once you have a grant in place and you have a project you want to implement, you need to get trained in project management to do that. Now, I know in your case, you've got some experience already, but not everybody does. We've got some CLG administrative staff who are actually the administrative assistant to the mayor, and they have no project management experience. So what we're going to do in mid-November is run a workshop just for CLG coordinators to train them in project management so that we can more effectively use these federal funds. Since you have both National Register districts and an overlay district here, it's important that you have every nomination and that you have every inventory form housed at the Kentucky Heritage Council for every property within the district. And you can bring that information into the meeting. That way people know what's at stake when an action is proposed. What are the defining characteristics of this property? Are they going to be compromised by the proposed action? There's fairly strict language for how to deal with that I'll be getting into in a minute. But it's up to Joni to bring that information to the board's fingertips. Okay. It's also important to know how to do a National Register nomination, even if you're not going to write it yourself, so that you can manage the project of a consultant creating a nomination for you, a district nomination. Same thing for what are the historic contexts that work for Danville, that are specific to Danville's history. If you want to do a grant just to hire an historian to develop context, historic context, they are the grounding for evaluating every historic resource that you have. What are the contributing, what are the non-contributing properties, and defining the features for individual resources that define its significance. We'll talk about those concepts in a moment. And of course, if anybody is not confident in your skills as an architectural historian, please come to us. We have people on staff who can help you through. Everybody has a harebrained building that does not fit in the pigeonholes. Come to us and we'll talk about it with you. The next thing I'm going to talk about is how to build a better board. So there's something kind of postmodern about doing that in front of the present board. I apologize, but some of this might sound familiar to you. You might have run into some of these issues. Every one of the board members needs to be capable of making an impartial decision. They need to be thick-skinned and not easily intimidated. They need to be inquisitive and willing to ask questions and then learn from the answers. They need to be willing to defend historic preservation policy. But most important, they need to show up. Because if they don't show up, you don't have a quorum and you can't get anything done. This board is the public representative of the city's preservation and stewardship ethic. That ethic I spoke of at the outset, that yes, I own the land, but my responsibility is to carry what's on it into the next generation for everybody's sake, for the sake of American culture. As a board member, you should be willing and able to defend historic preservation efforts in a grocery store line. An impromptu elevator speech on this is why we do this. This is why it's important. Every board member should have their own complete hard copies of the design review guidelines and the preservation ordinance. You should have personal copies of those things, and they should be numbered by paragraph so that you can refer to specific paragraphs in your decision making, and it makes it into the minutes, tying your decision back to the precedent, back to the law that's in place in your city already. During a board retreat, it would be a good idea for Joni to lead everybody in, it sounds like a touchy-feely corporate thing, but a SWOT exercise. It means strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. Most of you in business have been through this, through some middle management training or whatever. It's actually quite useful because everybody brings something different to the board, a different set of eyes, and everybody has different strengths. Somebody's really good at visualizing in 3 dimensions. Somebody is really good at, thank you, okay. Somebody is really good at doing property histories, at deed research. Somebody else is really good at talking and establishing rapport with anybody who walks in the door. You need a range of skills on the board. You can actually teach historic preservation and architectural history more easily than you can teach the skill somebody already has in them. And if you're after that specific skill, headhunt them and bring them in and teach them what they need to know. Weaknesses. I've been in board meetings like this. I don't mean offense, but does everybody in the board actually know what the hell is going on? I've been in board meetings where that was not true. Do you have somebody who wants to avoid conflict at all costs? Is there somebody who always caves, who doesn't hold the line when the line needs to be held? Those are the weaknesses. The threat, of course, everybody's familiar with. Serving on a preservation commission is a full contact sport. You'll lose some battles and you need to be prepared for that. Learn from your past mistakes and move on, and continue getting trained over and over and over. For new board members, and here I'm speaking directly to the mayor, we all know how frustrating it can be when the mayor appoints a board member for some reason other than their expertise. Yeah, that happens too. I hope it doesn't happen here, but it happens in lots of other cities. I've been in board meetings where some of the people reviewing these things had personal interests in the properties they were reviewing, and they didn't abstain. There are lots of different ways of compromising the board with a bad pick, but the biggest one of all is the person who comes on the board thinking that they are arbiters of taste, thinking that they're here to uphold some vision of the past that they've got in their head that might be different from what it actually was, and hasn't done the research, but feels themselves at an authority. Those people really need the training, really need the training. So here's the training. These are the essential concepts. You need to understand the National Register of Historic Places criteria for significance. You need to understand what I mean in a technical sense by historic contexts. You need to know what properties in the district are contributing to the district and which are non-contributing. Historic house, yes. Gas station, no. Except if the gas station was built in the 1940s and is a cool Art Deco design, in which case you need an historic context about Art Deco design in Danville, because there's probably more than one. What are the defining features of a given structure, of a given property? Property is slightly different from talking about building. Property really is a property, and it might have several different historic assets. It might be the house, it might be a flagstone sidewalk, it might be stone curbs, it might be a beautiful rock fence. There are lots of different assets that any one property might have, and they all might have a different inventory number, depending on how it was cataloged. And finally, you need to know how to assess resource integrity. I'm going to go over them each. Section 106, pardon me, of the National Historic Preservation Act of the 1960s defined 4 things as criteria, and they're easy to keep track of. One is, did an historic event happen here? The second is the place associated with an historic person? The third one is the most complicated one. It has to do with architecture. And please read it. The property embodies the distinctive characteristics of a type, a period, or a method of construction, or represents the work of a master, possesses high artistic values, and here is actually the most important one, or it represents a significant and distinguishable entity whose component parts may lack individual distinction. Now, it sounds like a mouthful, but I want you to think of a specific resource. A tenant farm, a tenant farmhouse. It's a class of resources. Your specific example may lack individual distinction, but if it's the representative of a larger entity, it gains significance by that. It's a member of a class of resources. D is usually used for archaeology sites. It's research potential of a property. Is it likely that it's going to yield more information than we know right now? And that's used for nominating archaeological resources to the National Register. Specific properties can be eligible under multiple criteria. It's easy enough to visualize. You have a famous person in a really cool house, or you have an historic event that happened at a specific property, or you have an archaeology site in the backyard of something that's already eligible. So you might have multiple criteria that you need to examine when somebody comes in and says they want to do something. Now, historic context, in this case, means something very specific. An historic context has to have a theme, an historic theme, that encompasses more than a single resource. You can't write an historic context about one property, but you can write it about a class of properties. That's the theme. An historic context has to have a specific date range, and it has to have a specific geographic range. So if you look at these titles, Frontier Federal, Early Antebellum Architecture and Streetscape in Washington, 1780 to 1848. It has a theme, it has a geographic extent, and it has a date range. And you can do that for each of these. There were actually more historic contexts in this particular project, but you can see the idea. You might, for events and people, the crafts, professions, and manufacturers in Old Washington. For specific kinds of stone resource, we had a stone-built landscape in this historic district. It looked like Society Hill in Philadelphia. It had flagstone sidewalks. It had stone-lined culverts. It had gutters beside the street that were made of brick, and it had, buried under the asphalt, cobblestone crosswalks at every intersection. So the public stone masonry made sense as an historic context for that particular district. If you want to capture somebody or some group that has been underrepresented in the historic record up to this point, you can define an historic context to capture that. It could be something like freedom seekers. It could be something like the African American neighborhoods. It could be Native American lifeways in this county, whatever. But that's what we mean by historic context: theme, geographic extent, and chronological extent. And you can use those for providing a context for any defined resource within your historic districts. For generating historic context for Danville, think about, just ask yourself these questions. When was the community founded? How long did that founding generation last? What came after that? What were the periods of economic prosperity and growth? Now, I can see by just driving in on 33 that you had several different periods of prosperity based on the waves of build-out that happened here by the architectural styles that you have. But an historian can tell you, well, what drove that economic boom at that time? And one of the things that you're doing is planning for the next economic boom and saving what might get built over when that happens. You also want an historic context for those periods of trial and tribulations, because there's going to be some properties that reflect that. And you might also ask yourself, what was the demographic influx and outflow in the history of Danville? Were there periods when there was a net loss of population? Was there a period when there was a huge boom in population? And those kinds of questions will yield your historic context for you. And I repeat again, you can hire an historian to study the history of the community and generate historic contexts that you can use for placing the cultural resources you have all over town. Finally, I caution that not all properties are equal. Within a given district, some properties contribute, some properties don't. Here we have a log house that is not from the frontier, it's from the 1840s, but it was built by a free black man. So it qualifies both by architecture and by an historic person. That Tidewater chimney is actually pretty specific. That would get that thing on the National Register all by itself. That freestanding upper section of the chimney is called a Tidewater chimney. Does the dentist's office in the upper left contribute to the district? No, actually, it's not of the proportion or scale of anything else in the district. And it's not yet 50 years old, so it technically can't be eligible for the National Register. So for the time being, it's a non-contributing property. And I caution you when saying that sometimes you can miss archaeology sites by discarding a property without actually seeing what was there before. There might have been something important there. It might have been the first house built in Danville or something like that. And keeping the historic contexts in mind as you evaluate these things, you can control for that situation. If a property is to embody the characteristics of your historic context and the characteristics of Criterion C, then you need to be able to define what characteristics, what features of that structure define it. And I can give you a pretty easy shorthand for doing it. Proportion and scale. Every period of architectural history has a defining proportion and scale. The green and the red on this slide were the result of a community-wide survey I did in an historic district where I measured the height, width, and length of every building from a specific period. The green was the frontier period, the red was the subsequent federal period. And then I compared that to the dentist's office, which is in the upper right. If I actually drew the dentist's office to scale, it would go off of this slide and into the flag of Kentucky off to the left, compared to the scale of what else was in the historic district. That dentist's office now stands opposite one of the log houses in town. It never should have gotten past the design review board, simply based on shape and scale, on size and scale, proportions. Another way is to talk about the materials and how they're used. A building should have some of its original materials still evident. That includes things like wood siding. That includes things like brick. Includes things like original windows. If you're trying to place what are the identifying characteristics of any given period in architectural history, here's some quick things that you can do. Look for the details of the door surrounds and the window surrounds, and look at the details of the roof line at the cornice and soffits. And between those things and the scale and proportion, you can come out with what is the architectural style of this building. You can do it for the Federal, you can do it for Greek Revival, you can do it for Gothic Revival, any of them, if you look at just those things. Those are the defining features of a given property. And when you have an action proposed in front of you, one of your questions has to be, what effect would this action have on the defining features of this property? What does it do to the original materials? What does it do to the doors and window surrounds? If he changes the dimensions of the window, that's a pretty substantial change. and you've compromised the defining features of the property at that point. I'm sorry, I'll try that again. Okay. There's a difference between the physical condition of a property and its integrity. A building can be abandoned for a couple of generations and still have those defining features around the doors, windows, and roofline. That's called integrity. On the right-hand side, this is the day that building was demolished. It had been empty for 60 years, but it was a wonderful 1790s example of an early federal building in an historic district. It got knocked down anyway. The other is the site of one of the earliest women's schools west of the Alleghenies. They taught the children, the girls, daughters of the first governor of Ohio, the first governor of Kentucky, and a lot of movers and shakers for both states. It's no longer there, right? So its integrity has been compromised. The only possible integrity for Mrs. Keats's school now would be criterion D if there's an archaeology site under that parking lot. But that's really all that would be left and all it's possible to be left of that. So its integrity, its ability to convey its significance has been compromised. It's a useful exercise, both for Joni in managing historic districts and for you in your decision-making in your meetings. Excuse me, here's an example. On the left, you have the same building with vinyl siding on it. On the right, with its original materials on display. And you'll notice they also took down the tower when that happened. That's in downtown Maysville. It would be useful to make a table like this for each of your historic districts. You put the address and the inventory number by which that address is known in Frankfurt in the first column. And it might be multiple resources in a single property, a single address. And the second, is it contributing or not contributing? And if it is, under what criterion? It might be multiple criteria, A, B, and C. It might simply be that sidewalk under criterion C, that flagstone sidewalk from the 18 teens. And finally, the third problem, what's the relevant historic context and theme for each of those properties? What theme does it fit within? And this information is the yardstick that you use in measuring the effects of the proposed action. Boards of architectural review need to become, and this is on a nationwide scale, need to become both much more collaborative with landowners and more strict. But it's important that you educate before you mandate. That means getting every landowner in the district a copy of the design review guidelines, getting them a copy of the preservation ordinance, putting it in the hands of every realtor in town, along with a map of the boundaries of the historic district, and teach the realtors to refer to that as an asset for their future property values rather than as a restriction, which is what they've been trained to do. They've been trained to call it a restriction. It's not. It's an asset. It's going to improve their property values. There's been a wonderful recent study that just came out this year out of Johns Hopkins University about Philadelphia. So Baltimore's trying to teach something to Philadelphia. They studied thousands of renovations on hundreds of city blocks in blighted neighborhoods. And they found that a single renovated property on the face of the block would create a drop in the crime rate of 30%. Now, is that cause and effect? No, but they cohere. They are of the same. If you do one, the other seems to correspond with it. And if you do multiple renovations, it's an increase in the standard of living for everybody on the block. Realtors need to know that. Real estate lawyers need to know that when they talk about properties, that being in the historic district is an asset. you need to be able to refer your landowners to the vendors and tradesmen who can help them meet the design review requirements. It's a good idea to have a list of vendors out there who have the appropriate materials for doing the work. It's a good idea to find, for example, talk to lumber yards and warn them about the terrible fire danger of vinyl siding. It's illegal in Europe for just that reason. It's far more poisonous when it burns than the smoke. It outgasses as it burns, and that gas is poisonous. Also educate the lumber yards in what the moldings of historic properties look like, and ask them to start stocking the router bits for fixing that stuff, so that a homeowner can buy the router bit, or a tradesman can buy the router bit that will fix up the house. It's a good idea to have a show and tell in these meetings of the difference between old growth lumber and modern lumber. And all you need is a couple of 2x4s. One of them will actually be 2 inches by 4 inches because it's the old one. And the tree rings will be very dense. It's old growth. Hold up a modern 2x4 from Lowe's. Nobody here owns Lowe's. It's going to have very few tree rings in it. It's going to be soft enough you can dent it with your fingernail. That's new lumber. So please, even if you live up to the standard of replacing your window with modern wood, you're still making a mistake. You should be fixing that old growth lumber because it's going to last a lot longer than any modern wooden window. You should familiarize yourself with what things cost to fix. What does it cost to put a new door on an historic place? Up to Secretary of Interior's guidelines. What does it cost to rebuild a 2-sash window? Well, I'll tell you, it costs $350 average nationwide. And that's competitive with the cost of replacement windows if you're going with double glazing. $350 for a 2-sash window. And that's removing it, stripping it, repairing the wood, reglazing every pane, and repainting it and reinstalling it. $350. It's nationwide average. No, there's something you folks should be aware of. There's a national organization of boards that do exactly what you do. It's the National Association of Preservation Commissions. And you can get an email feed where you can post a question to everybody else in the country who's doing this and ask them, to cite their source. And we have some remarkably well-educated people working just as Joni does to back up what this board needs to be doing with hard figures. It's a very useful resource. And of course, the National Register has their own figures for things, and the National Park Service maintains a database on this stuff too. But it's a good idea to have an idea of what it's going to cost for this person to do it up to your standard before you ask them to. And although it has been said that if you start enforcing more strictly, suddenly everybody has the money, we all know that it's an unfortunate realization that most of the people living in our historic housing stock today are not as wealthy as the people that built the structure, which makes it harder. And it's important for this board to be humane and gracious in dealing with people who really can't afford to do what you're asking, and help them plan it into bite-sized pieces so that they can do a little bit at a time up to the standard that you need, without discouraging them entirely, without turning them away and saying, no, it can't be done, because then they'll walk away. You don't want them to walk away. You want them to be able to do the project up to the standard that you're enforcing. So you need to make sure that everyone living and owning in the district understands the rule and why they're important. Make that stack of hard copies of the design review guidelines and hand them out like popcorn. Send out postcards every time there's a win. every time there's a new renovation. And buy one of those signs that politicians use when they're running for office with the two stakes in it that you put on yards. And put one in the front yard of every renovation going on in town and name the date and history of the house if you can. Put a seal of the city of Danville on it and put the contractor's logo on it and say, another renovation in progress in great big bold letters that people can read. If you have a critical mass of 2 or 3 renovations going on within a couple of blocks of each other, property starts to change hands really quickly as people invest in those 2 blocks because there's a buzz, because there's an enthusiasm, a momentum to what's going on. And it picks up very quickly if you get 2 or 3 of them going at once in a small area. But those signs help a lot. Postcards to the landowners, advertising the wins, or reminding them of that this board is at their disposal if they're contemplating a renovation of some kind to help them get through the process. Like it or not, your existing design review guidelines, and I haven't read them, may need to be rewritten. You need to pull out all of the words that say should or preferred and replace them with the words must and shall, because you are a quasi-judicial body and you are making decisions that have the force of law, and you can be sued if you do it wrong. So the guidelines have to reflect that. They need to say not should or preferred, but must and shall. Because the BAR is a quasi-judicial body, never let a board member make a comment on the record like, oh, I think that's pretty. You can be sued for that. Compliment the landowner once the microphone is off, and that's perfectly acceptable. It's gracious to do so. But you're not an arbiter of taste. The board is measuring a proposed action against objective standards, and you need to make sure every board member knows that. They can compliment the landowner after the mic's off. Show every courtesy to anybody who shows up at a meeting, and during the meeting, explain to them how the procedure works and what they're using to measure their proposal against, what you're using. Well, we're going to talk about why it's eligible for a nationwide inventory of historic properties, and what are the defining features that enforce that eligibility, that embody those federally recognized characteristics. And then we compare that to what you want to do. You know, you can make it as simple as that, but they need to understand the process that you're going through. It's also kind of important that you never give an opinion of what the board will decide in advance of the meeting. There's a great temptation if somebody comes to you and you say, do you think this will be okay? You can say, I'd take a look at the design review guidelines and check. But no matter how off the record you think the situation is, if they have probable cause to think it's going to sail through and it doesn't, they can sue you. For every case that comes before the board, someone has to make clear the defining characteristics of the property, what the design review guidelines say about the proposed treatment. And it's the BAR, the coordinator's job to provide that information. Before the meeting happens, you should know if the property is a contributing element within the historic district or not. Not all properties are going to be significant because of their architecture. It could be an event, a person, something that you hadn't thought of. And most of you aren't professional architectural historians, but you should be able to point out to your board what features define the architectural style of the property and what effect the proposed action will have on those defining features. And it's important to have copies of photos and site forms and the guidelines here in the room with you so people can refer to it if they need to. And bring any data you've got about the history of the structure. If you've got an old photo, have it in the room. If you have an old map, bring it in so that people have a basis for some of their decision-making. Now, the ideal design review meeting is eating ice creams outside in the sun. The model design review meeting is something different, and I'm handing these out for your reference later. The same slide. So here's what a model meeting would look like. As a quasi-legal body making legally binding decisions, you need to establish a standard procedure for arriving at decisions. Now, I was really happy today to hear you folks building a finding of fact before ruling. That's a great protection of you for this board. There are some steps that you can make more overt, so that everybody knows that the procedure's been followed. What you want to do is establish a procedure that if somebody came in here with 3 different properties but all the same issue, you'd arrive at the same conclusions 3 different times. It needs to be a pattern. And the first question is going to be, what's the proposed action? And you let the applicant speak or have the action laid out by staff and bring all that documentation with you. Where is the proposed action? Photos, maps, historic maps, maybe insurance maps, the old Sanborns, something like that. Is the property a contributing element within the historic district? And if it is, under which criterion? People, events, outstanding example of the type, or research value, one of the 4. What are the defining elements of the property? Doors, windows, proportions, size, cornice, and eaves. Can it be defined by a specific architectural type, a style? What do the design review guidelines and the current preservation ordinance have to say about the proposed action? And at that point, Tom summarizes the facts as known and creates a finding of fact. That's the finding of fact. But and notice the steps. What is it? Where is it? Is it a contributing element? Which criterion? It's also worth asking which historic context. And what are the defining elements? Those are the and then what does the preservation ordinance and what are the design review guidelines say about the proposed action? Those are the finding of facts. After the finding of fact, open it up for discussion among yourselves. Will the proposed action compromise the defining features of the property? Does it meet the design review guidelines? Based on which parts of the design review guidelines? That's where numbered paragraphs come in handy. Then there's a motion to approve or deny. It's after that motion of approve or deny that you can offer to suggest a range of alternatives as necessary. You don't want to get into a discussion of altering the application on the fly in open session. What you want to do is propose something after you've already made a ruling on the proposal as it came into the room. After that, you can propose alternatives. You can suggest, have you considered this material rather than that material? Have you talked to these folks over here? They can custom design the window sash for you or whatever it happens to be. I say windows and siding, those are the 2 biggest things that ever come before any of these boards, windows and sidings. You need to be particularly careful if somebody wants to build an addition or if they want to build from scratch an infill project within your historic district. In those cases, there are 2 things. One, never attach a garage to an historic structure unless it was built after the automobile came about. And my mind just went blank, I'm sorry. Always check the proposed construction for its proportions and scale. They need to fit within the proportions and scale of the block where they're proposed to be built. In some historic districts, early federal architecture was often very urban. It was often brick row houses, small two-story brick row houses that sat right on the sidewalk. We call that zero setback. There was no setback from the sidewalk. They were built right there. And it is a very urban thing. You see a lot of it in Philadelphia and Baltimore and Boston, old cities, Charlotte, Charleston. If you've got blocks of zero setback, the proposed construction shouldn't be halfway across the lot, creating an indent in the streetscape. You want it built at zero setback. Something to think about. I don't know the answer to this. Does Danville have a community college? Does? Okay, yep. Use our grant money to ask somebody to teach a historic preservation class or an architectural history class using the building stock of Danville as the subject matter. And invite your entire board for training, publicize the class to every landowner in the overlay district. By that, I mean a personal invitation. Publicize the class to every general contractor and lumberyard owner. Publicize the class to every realtor. Publicize it to all elected and managerial officials. Don't forget Public Works. You want those guys to understand what they're dealing with too. And an ad in the paper isn't going to be enough. You want to send invitations to people so they feel like they've personally been invited. It's important that everybody in your city management is on board with what you're trying to accomplish. And yeah, there are going to be holdouts. Yeah, there are going to be personalities that aren't in line with everybody else. Every city has them. But by and large, you want to sell this to your city. And one way of doing that is to have Joni show up at planning and zoning meetings and other city commissioners meetings and talk about the wins, talk about the renovations that have happened, or the number of certificates of appropriateness that have been passed. Something that demonstrates what you do and explain why that's important and why it's a good thing for the neighborhood that this has occurred. And gradually, over a period of time, people will come to see that as a matter of course, that yes, we're doing good things over there with design review. A lot of preservation plans written in the last 20 years have said, we want to make sure that every deed for every property in the historic district notes that they're in the historic district on the deed, so that when somebody buys the property, they know. As a practical consideration, it almost never gets done because it would require daily contact with the county clerk, and it would require daily contact with every real estate lawyer in town so that every closing was recorded and you knew whether or not it was in the district. It's not going to work that way. So it's all the more important that those real estate lawyers and realtors have a map of the district and have been taught to consider it an asset. This is for a class, but just as an example, but I show you this picture. One of the fun things you can do in an historic district is have an open house of several houses with people walking between them. If you decide to do that, do it at dusk. Have tour guides with flashlights for every group going through so that out on the sidewalk, everybody sees what they're doing. But inside, use period correct lighting. Use candles and kerosene lamps because the interior design on an historic house is going to pop when you show it in the lighting that was there when it was built. And this is an example of what I mean. You can, with a fluorescent tube along the ceiling, you could flatten that out. It wouldn't look any different from a tract house. But with a candle under it, this is what it looks like. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
One thing, this was years ago, I would suggest adding to the list that you mentioned contractor real estate.
Yeah.
Is we went to some of our sign companies.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
You know, they may order a sign this large or this, but you might have a problem installing it.
right,
So, do what the customer orders, but
Yeah.
you might want to tell them that
yeah,
that won't work in this area.
sure,
It took us a little while to finally get through to this, and I think after a while, they started, okay, we understand, we want to do this in that area.
right, right. And so a map of the district behind the counter for those people would be very useful, yeah. When you're, use our money, do a preservation building trades workshop on whatever you want, on rebuilding stone fences, on helping landowners rebuild their shutters, whatever it happens to be. There is a large range of preservation building tradesmen out there who are willing to give these workshops, and we will pay for it using CLG funds. If you go that route, and it's important because what you want to do is give a tuition relief for the class to every tradesman in town who does this kind of work so that they learn how to do it to federal standards. But if you do, if you're training youth, and we need more of them, don't just train them how to fix the shutter. You need to train them how to get a bank loan, how to cost a project, how to behave in a professional manner with their customers. These are soft skills that a lot of our youth doesn't know anything about, and they're very important. And that concludes my talk. That skills training to the youth is kind of the Hail Mary pass that you need for taking this whole effort into the next generation. Questions?
I've got multiple questions.
Okay.
That are important to me, but they
Yes.
might not be important to other people, but I'm going to ask them, okay? One of the questions I have, you talked about local government in the beginning. In some of the other cities around the state that you're familiar with, when you say local government, I judge that means all the governments, do the counties participate with the cities? And if so, how do they do that?
Some do, some don't. Some are joint governments to begin with, so yes, those participate, like Lexington, Fayette County. But say in a place like where I'm from in Maysville, Kentucky, in Mason County, the only time the county would get involved is if there's county properties within your downtown historic district, or if a landowner has created a National Register property, had their property nominated to the National Register out in the county.
Okay. Which leads to my other statement. Do we ever go to the county and ask them to participate with us if there's a building in the historic district?
If I can get this to come on, we would if that ever comes up in front of us, but currently none of the county buildings have come up within the district.
Should not we take the initiative to do that, maybe? I mean, if they could participate with us.
Sure.
Financially or, supportive way, not necessarily financially, but any supportive affirmation we would get from the county would be an asset, in my opinion.
Certainly,
Is that up to the city? Is that up to the?
it would be up, I would think, to the city manager to approach the county judge to do
well,
that.
that's a start.
If there's a National Register nomination that is to come in front of the board and it is in the county, we would ask the county fiscal court to bless that as well. But to just approach the county for financial support, that would be something, Mayor, that I suspect the current mayor, Mr. Paris, or the city manager would need to talk to the county judge about.
Okay.
So, but on our part, if we get a National Register nomination that's out in the county that you all have to review, we would certainly take that in front of the fiscal court. But we haven't had that yet.
That's a good idea.
so,
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
I can give you another example of when you might want to be involved out in the county. There's a whole nother arm of federal historic preservation law called Section 106. And what it means is if you're using federal funds for a construction project, or if you require a federal permit for a construction project, and here I'm talking about things like a new road or a pipeline project or something like that, a long corridor with multiple properties involved, if you know that such a project is coming through, those projects are subject to the same laws that you folks are. And generally, they can't be constructed until those investigations have been conducted about what are the cultural resources within the right-of-way. If there's something that's eligible for the National Register, how do we mitigate the effect of the proposed action on that property? And that's a place where if somebody is creating a mitigation plan for property out in the county, you could have input on how that mitigation, on what constitutes a mitigation for those properties.
I guess where I'm really coming from, in the city of Maysville, Kentucky, where you're from,
Yeah,
and the county of Mason, I think that's okay.
that's right.
Does the county ever participate, does the Mason County ever participate with Maysville in the historic district inside the city limits?
Only if it's a county-owned property.
Only what?
If it's a county-owned property.
So if it's, if I owned a piece of property in downtown Maysville,
Yeah.
then the county would not participate.
Not
Well,
necessarily.
how do you get them to participate? That, you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah, I do. We were fortunate for the last two county executives. They were actually hiring people to do inventory under their own budgets, which is fascinating. But I recognize that doesn't happen everywhere.
Should that be up to the state legislators to do that? To require the counties to participate?
It's a possibility. It's not a requirement under federal law that the counties participate in the CLG program, but the CLG program does allow the counties to participate.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, I think you answered my question.
You also brought up a different question that I'd like to address about sharing finances. It's really a good idea to learn who the nonprofit organizations are in your city that are favorable to historic preservation, because it is allowable under federal guidelines for the city to share the burden of a match for a grant with a nonprofit, with a local nonprofit. So say your DAR has a bank account and they're interested in work on a specific property that was related to one of their own. That would be a good example of a place where you could team up to match a grant.
How does the city of Maysville participate with a private property owner who's in a historic district? How do they participate with them? Do they have moratorium? Do they have tax credits? How do they do that? Or do they do that?
Yes, it's a pretty active program. They've got both a Main Street program and a CLG program in Maysville. And the Main Street.
Excuse me, could you let Joni know how they work together in Maysville?
The Main Street program?
Yes. Are they different than ours?
No, it's the same. It's the same state-run program. It's Kitty Dogood would be your liaison.
And also, I attend the Main Street, I'm on the design committee for the Main Street program as a liaison for this board. So when their grants come through, like their facade grants, I generally look at those and talk with the folks who receive those grants. So we do participate pretty well with Main Street now.
The city does.
Yes, the city employees meet, so.
I understand that.
And that actually extends to Maysville as well. It's the CLG coordinator who's the public outreach arm of the city for the historic districts and to landowners and other constituents within the city.
This is probably a question that I shouldn't ask, but I'm going to anyway.
Please.
So, how do we educate the property owner or the landowner before they need a COA?
Make sure they have a hard copy of the design review guidelines just by virtue of owning the property. If they're in the district, they should have their own copy.
Do we do
of
that? Do we?
Yeah, yeah. And I would also recommend more fun things than that, like a class out at the community college, that sort of thing, or a walking tour.
How do you know a property is contributing? You mentioned that a while ago.
Okay. is it eligible for the National Register? Under
I
what
see.
criterion? And by what historic context?
Okay.
And if it's not eligible for the National Register in its
gotcha.
own right, in some cases, it's because nobody's come up with the context yet, like that Art Deco gas station I suggested, in which case, yeah, it's older than 50 years old. It's a significant architectural style. This one still has some of that stuff in it. So let's consider that as potentially eligible.
And my last question is David Morgan still around?
No, I wish he was. He was the head of the Heritage
did a nice
Council for
job.
years and years. He was a wonderful guy.
And Mayor, just to let you know, with the last couple grants that we have had to do surveys within the existing districts and to branch out on some of the side streets that we have not yet surveyed, one of the requirements from me is that the consultant either name them as contributing or non-contributing, so that we have a pretty comprehensive list of what's contributing in the district. And when I look at the information I present to you all, that's a big key factor in what we can and cannot do to those buildings, if it's a contributing factor.
I guess where I'm really coming from is I'm a private property owner. I own a historic building on Main Street that's in the district. And if it
And
needs.
it's contributing. That's
what?
that's contributing. Your building is contributing.
Do what?
Your building is a contributing building to the district.
Well, my question is, if the city and the community wants me to do something to that building to maintain it, are there tax credits?
Yes.
They are?
Yes.
They are
Yes,
tax credits?
absolutely.
There are both state and federal tax credits available.
Okay,
Yeah, two different programs.
I'm done, Mr. Chairman.
And if you need some help with that, let me know, John. I'll help you. We want
Thanks.
to do that.
Thank you.
Sure.
Fantastic.
Great, okay. Thank you all for inviting me here, and thank you for your time.
Second.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks for coming down, Miller.
And I will, Mr. Miller will send, I have got copies of this presentation I'll be sending to you guys. And I know that Mary called me, she has some issues going on at work this morning, so she's going to do this with the video. So thank you guys for showing up.
You bet.